The winter of 2024 hit Chicago like a hammer to glass, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache and your breath freeze right in front of your face. On this particular December morning, the wind was whipping through the streets, turning every corner into a mini tornado of fallen leaves and forgotten newspaper pages. 17-year-old Jasmine Taylor stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully wrapping her favorite purple scarf around her neck. The soft wool felt warm against her skin, carrying the faint scent of her grandmother's house, where it had been knitted with love just months ago for her birthday. She smiled at her reflection, remembering how her grandma had stayed up late for weeks working on it, making sure every stitch was perfect. "Baby, you're gonna be late." Her mom's voice carried up the stairs, mixing with the sounds of morning cartoons her little brother was watching. "Coming," Jasmine called back, grabbing her backpack and thundering down the stairs of their modest two-story home. The house might have been small, but it was filled with warmth and the smell of her mom's famous cinnamon oatmeal. "Got your lunch?" her mom asked, already knowing the answer but asking anyway, like she did every morning. She stood by the kitchen counter, her nurse's scrubs already on, hair neatly tied back for her early hospital shift. "Yes, Mom," Jasmine replied, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek. "And my library badge, and my phone is charged, and yes, I'll text when I get there." Her mom smiled, that proud but worried smile that all moms seem to master. "That's my girl. Bundle up tight. It's brutal out there today." Jasmine stepped out into the morning chill, immediately grateful for her warm layers. The walk to the bus stop usually took about 10 minutes, but today she walked faster, trying to outrun the cold that seemed determined to freeze everything it touched. As she turned the corner onto Madison Street, she saw the usual morning crowd at the bus stop. The construction worker with his thermos of coffee, the twins from her school arguing about some video game, and the lady who always had her nose buried in a thick novel. But today, there was someone new. An elderly woman stood slightly apart from the group, her thin jacket clearly not enough for the brutal Chicago winter. Her hands, red and raw from the cold, trembled as she tried to check her watch. She kept stamping her feet, trying to generate some warmth, but Jasmine could see she was fighting a losing battle against the winter wind. Jasmine found herself slowing down as she approached the bus stop. Something about the woman's vulnerability tugged at her heart. She thought about her own grandmother, how she always said that kindness was like bread, you should share it while it's still warm. The woman's shoulders shook with another violent shiver, and without really thinking about it, Jasmine's hands moved to her own scarf. She hesitated for just a moment. This was her favorite scarf after all, the one her grandma had made specially for her. But then she remembered something else her grandma always said: "The things we own are just things, but the kindness we share becomes part of who we are." Jasmine knew she might be late for her shift at the library. She knew some people might think it weird for a young black girl to approach an elderly white woman at a bus stop. She knew all the reasons why she should just mind her own business, like people in the city usually did. But sometimes the heart knows better than the head what needs to be done. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her boots crunching in the thin layer of frost that covered the sidewalk. The elderly woman looked up, surprise flickering across her face as Jasmine approached. But it wasn't fear or suspicion in her eyes, just genuine surprise that anyone had noticed her discomfort. Unknown to both of them, this simple moment on a cold Chicago morning was about to set in motion a chain of events that would touch not just their lives, but the lives of countless others. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures, and on this frosty December morning, change was about to arrive wearing a hand-knitted purple scarf. Jasmine's boots crunched in the snow as she stepped closer to the elderly woman. The morning traffic hummed in the background, and somewhere nearby, a street vendor's coffee cart released wisps of warm, inviting steam into the frozen air. The woman, who would later introduce herself as Margaret Wilson, looked up with tired eyes that had seen decades of Chicago winters come and go. "Excuse me," Jasmine said softly, her breath visible in the cold air. "I noticed you're shivering." Her fingers worked at unwrapping her purple scarf, the wool soft and warm against her skin. Each unwinding of the fabric brought back memories of her grandmother sitting in her favorite armchair, knitting needles clicking away as she told stories about her own youth. Margaret's eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and uncertainty crossing her face. In a city where most people hurried past each other without a second glance, this unexpected interaction seemed to catch her off guard. Her arthritis-stricken fingers clutched at her thin jacket, trying to hold on to whatever warmth it provided. "Oh dear, that's very kind, but I couldn't possibly." Margaret started to protest, but another harsh gust of wind cut through the bus stop, making her words trail off into a shiver. The other commuters huddled deeper into their winter gear, everyone locked in their own morning routines, barely noticing the scene unfolding before them. "Please," Jasmine insisted, remembering how her mother always taught her that kindness should be offered gently but firmly. "My grandma always says a warm neck keeps the whole body happy." She smiled, holding out the scarf. The morning sun caught the purple threads, showing off the intricate pattern her grandmother had worked into the wool. Margaret hesitated for just a moment longer, then nodded gratefully. Her hands trembled, partly from cold and partly from emotion, as Jasmine stepped forward to help wrap the scarf around her neck. The wool, still warm from Jasmine's own body heat, seemed to bring immediate relief. "Your grandmother must be quite the knitter," Margaret said, her voice warmer now, touching the detailed stitching with appreciative fingers. "I used to knit myself before my arthritis got too bad." She flexed her fingers unconsciously, as if remembering the feeling of holding knitting needles. Jasmine beamed with pride. "She is. She taught me a little, but I'm nowhere near as good. She made this for my birthday last month." She didn't mention that it was her favorite scarf, or that she'd spent nearly an hour that morning deciding what to wear with it. Some things didn't need to be said. The city bus could be heard rumbling around the corner, but in that moment, neither woman was paying much attention to it. Margaret reached out and patted Jasmine's hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You remind me of my granddaughter," she said softly. "She's away at college now, always thinking of others, just like you." Other passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to board, but Margaret and Jasmine remained in their own little bubble of connection. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the frost-covered sidewalk, but somehow the air between them felt warmer. "I'm already running a bit late for my job at the library," Jasmine admitted with a small laugh. "But you know what my mom always says? Being on time is important, but being kind is even more important." Margaret smiled, adjusting the scarf more snugly around her neck. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman. You must get it from both sides of the family." She paused, then added, "I'm Margaret, by the way, Margaret Wilson." "Jasmine Taylor," Jasmine replied, just as the bus doors opened with a hydraulic hiss. "And please keep the scarf. It looks better on you anyway." She grinned, stepping back as other passengers began to board. What neither woman realized in that moment was how many people had witnessed their interaction. A young man with a phone had captured the entire exchange, moved by the simple beauty of the moment. In his caption, he would later write, "In a world where we're told to fear each other, two strangers just showed us what humanity really looks like." As the bus pulled away from the curb, Jasmine waved goodbye to Margaret, who touched the scarf gently, as if it were made of something more precious than wool. Neither of them could have known that this simple exchange would soon catch fire in the hearts of people across the city and beyond. Sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the ones that shake the earth, but the quiet ones that remind us of our shared humanity. Jasmine turned away, her neck a bit colder, but her heart considerably warmer, and started walking toward the library. She was definitely going to be late now, but somehow she couldn't bring herself to mind. Some mornings are worth being late for. It started with a single post. A young graphic designer named Tom Chen had been standing near the back of the bus stop crowd that morning, scrolling through his phone like everyone else. But something made him look up just as Jasmine approached Margaret. Maybe it was the unusual sight of someone actually breaking the invisible barrier that typically separated strangers in the city, or maybe it was just luck. Either way, he raised his phone and started recording. The video wasn't particularly fancy, just a steady shot of a young black girl carefully wrapping her scarf around an elderly white woman's neck. No special effects, no background music, just the natural sounds of the city morning and two people connecting through a simple act of kindness. Tom added a simple caption, "Just witnessed this on my morning commute. There's still good in the world. #ChicagoKindness." He posted it before boarding his bus, tucked his phone away, and promptly forgot about it as he headed to work. But the internet had other plans. By lunchtime, the video had been shared thousands of times. People who normally posted about their coffee or complained about traffic were suddenly sharing this quiet moment of humanity. The comment section filled up with people sharing their own stories of unexpected kindness, creating a ripple effect of positivity. "This is the Chicago I know and love," wrote one commuter. "Been feeling down about the state of the world lately. Needed to see this today," commented another. Local news stations, always hungry for positive stories to balance out their usual fare of crime reports and political drama, picked up on the trending video. A reporter from Channel 7 tracked down Tom through his social media profile. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time," Tom explained during his interview. But what really struck me was how natural it was. The young girl didn't do it for attention or to make a statement. She just saw someone who was cold and decided to help. The story might have ended there, just another viral moment in the endless scroll of social media. But something about this particular video touched a deeper nerve in a city often divided by race, age, and neighborhood boundaries. Community groups started sharing it with messages about breaking down barriers. Teachers showed it in classrooms to spark discussions about kindness and prejudice. Religious leaders of different faiths referenced it in their sermons and speeches. By dinner time, Jasmine's phone was buzzing nonstop. Her friends had recognized her in the video, which had now been viewed over 1 million times. Her little brother ran into her room, excited. "You're famous, sis. You're all over TikTok." But Jasmine felt overwhelmed by the attention. "I just did what anyone would do," she kept telling people. She hadn't even known someone was filming. That evening, as she sat with her family watching the local news coverage, her mom squeezed her hand tight. "You did what anyone could do," her mom corrected gently, "but not what everyone would do. That's what makes it special." The video sparked conversations across the city. In coffee shops and at dinner tables, people talked about how small actions could bridge big divides. Some questioned why a simple act of kindness between people of different races and ages had become such big news. Wasn't this how things should be normally? Margaret's granddaughter, away at college in Boston, recognized her grandmother in the viral video. She called home immediately, crying happy tears. "Grandma, you're trending on Twitter," she exclaimed, then had to explain to Margaret what trending meant. The story took on a life of its own as more details emerged. People discovered that Margaret was a retired schoolteacher who had spent 40 years teaching in Chicago's public schools. Someone found out that Jasmine worked at the library and was saving up for college while helping care for her younger siblings. These personal details transformed the viral moment into something more meaningful. It wasn't just a random act of kindness anymore, it was a story about real people, about the connections possible in a city where people too often walked past each other without a second glance. Local businesses started getting involved. A coffee shop near the famous bus stop created a purple scarf special and donated part of the proceeds to youth programs. A knitting circle at the senior center started making purple scarves to give away to people in need. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the everyday people who were inspired to create their own moments of connection. Reports started coming in of similar acts of kindness across the city. People began looking up from their phones more often, paying attention to those around them. The video had done something remarkable. It had reminded people that sometimes the smallest gestures could create the biggest changes. In a world that often seemed divided by invisible lines, a simple purple scarf had become a symbol of how easily those lines could be crossed with just a little bit of kindness. Channel 7's morning show decided to do a follow-up story about the viral scarf video. They managed to track down Margaret through her granddaughter's social media post, and soon a news crew was setting up equipment in her elegant Lincoln Park home. The house itself told a story, filled with photographs spanning decades, art collected from travels around the world, and furniture that whispered of history. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, still wearing the purple scarf that had started it all. "I wasn't supposed to be taking the bus that day," she admitted to the interviewer, running her fingers over the wall. "I usually have a driver, you see. But Robert, he's been driving for our family for 20 years. His daughter had a baby that morning. I insisted he take the day off to meet his first grandchild." The interviewer leaned forward, intrigued. "Your family has a driver?" Margaret smiled, a bit embarrassed. "Yes, well, my late husband, James Wilson, built half the buildings in the Chicago skyline. Wilson Development Corporation, that was his life's work. The crew exchanged glances. James Wilson was a legend in Chicago real estate. His company had shaped the city's architecture for decades. The revelation that his widow had been the elderly woman at the bus stop added another layer to the already compelling story. "Why didn't you call for a taxi or use a ride-sharing app?" the interviewer asked. Margaret's laugh was warm and genuine. "Oh, I'm terrible with those phone apps. My grandchildren try to teach me, but I'm a bit old-fashioned. Besides," she added, her eyes twinkling, "I've lived in Chicago for 78 years. Sometimes it's nice to experience the city like everyone else does." The interview continued, with Margaret sharing stories about her life with James, their philanthropy work, and their deep love for Chicago. But she kept coming back to that morning at the bus stop and Jasmine's kindness. "You know what touched me the most?" Margaret said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "She had no idea who I was. To her, I was just another person who needed help. That's pure kindness, the kind that doesn't ask for names or status or anything in return." Meanwhile, across town, Jasmine was shelving books at the library, completely unaware of these developments. Her phone had been buzzing all morning with messages from friends who'd seen the morning show, but library rules meant keeping it on silent during her shift. During her lunch break, she finally checked her messages and nearly dropped her sandwich. Her best friend had sent her a link to an article, "Mystery Woman from Viral Scarf Video Revealed as Widow of Chicago Real Estate Legend." "I just gave my scarf to someone who was cold," Jasmine told her coworker, shaking her head in disbelief. "I didn't know she was. I mean, it wouldn't have mattered if I did know, but..." The story took another turn when the afternoon papers picked it up. Headlines read, "Kindness Knows No Boundaries. How a Teenage Girl's Simple Act Connected Two Worlds." Reporters dug into the Wilson family history, uncovering decades of quiet philanthropy that Margaret and James had done for the city. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. The story reached Silicon Valley, where Margaret's grandson, Peter Wilson, was having his morning coffee and scrolling through his newsfeed. Peter had inherited his grandfather's business sense, but applied it to technology instead of real estate. His software company was one of the fastest growing in the industry. Watching the interview of his grandmother, still wearing that purple scarf, Peter felt something shift inside him. He'd been so busy building his tech empire that he'd missed the last 3 family Thanksgivings. Seeing his grandmother on that cold bus stop, being helped by a stranger when her own grandson was too busy to check on her regularly, it hit him hard. He immediately called his assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the next few days," he said. "Book me on the next flight to Chicago. And find out everything you can about the girl with the scarf, especially what she wants to do with her future." The assistant, used to Peter's quick decisions, simply asked, "Personal or business?" Peter looked again at the image of his grandmother, her eyes bright with tears as she talked about Jasmine's kindness. "Both," he replied. "Definitely both." As the day wound down, Margaret sat in her study, looking at old photos of James. "You'd have loved this story, dear," she said to his picture. "You always said the true measure of a city isn't in its buildings, but in its people." She touched the purple scarf still around her neck. From her window, she could see some of the buildings James had built, their windows catching the sunset. But somehow, this simple piece of wall felt more valuable than all of them combined. It had reminded her, and now the whole city, that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or sold. They could only be given freely with an open heart, just like a young girl had done on a cold morning at a bus stop. The library was unusually quiet that Thursday afternoon when Jasmine's supervisor called her into the office. Her first thought was worry. Had she misshelved books again? But the smile on her supervisor's face told a different story. "There's someone here to see you," she said, opening the door wider to reveal Margaret sitting there, still wearing the purple scarf, and next to her was a tall man in a casual but expensive-looking sweater. "Hi, Jasmine," Margaret said warmly, standing up to give her a hug. "This is my grandson, Peter. He flew in from California because he wanted to meet you." Peter Wilson didn't look like the typical tech billionaire you'd see in magazines. He wore sneakers with his designer jeans and had a kind face that reminded Jasmine of Margaret's. He stood up and offered his hand. "My grandmother hasn't stopped talking about you since I arrived," he said with a genuine smile. Would you have time to join us for coffee? There's something we'd like to discuss with you. The library's break room wasn't exactly fancy, but nobody seemed to mind. They sat around a small table, steam rising from paper cups of vending machine coffee. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she held her cup. "Tell me about your dreams, Jasmine," Peter said, leaning forward. "What do you want to do with your life?" Jasmine glanced at the books surrounding them. "I love libraries," she said softly. "They're like these magical places where anyone can come and learn anything. Rich or poor, young or old, knowledge is free here." She paused, gathering courage. "I want to study library science, maybe even help modernize libraries in neighborhoods that need them most. But college is expensive," Peter finished for her. Jasmine nodded, looking down at her coffee. "Did you know my grandfather started with nothing?" Peter asked. "He built his first building with borrowed money and a dream, but someone gave him a chance. A bank manager who saw potential in a young man others might have overlooked." Margaret reached over and patted Jasmine's hand. "When you gave me that scarf, you weren't looking for anything in return. That's rare in today's world. But kindness has a way of coming back around." Peter pulled out his tablet and opened a document. "I've set up a scholarship fund through my foundation. Full ride to any university you choose, plus living expenses and a stipend for books and supplies. But that's just the beginning." Jasmine's eyes widened as Peter continued explaining. The scholarship wasn't just for her. It would help 5 other students each year, specifically chosen from underprivileged backgrounds. The recipients would be called Purple Scarf Scholars. "My grandfather always said that real success isn't just about making money," Peter explained. "It's about creating opportunities for others. Your act of kindness showed me that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures." Tears welled up in Jasmine's eyes. She thought about her mom working double shifts at the hospital, her little brother's college fund that barely had $100 in it, all those nights wondering if her dreams would have to stay just dreams. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll accept," Margaret smiled. "And promise to keep being exactly who you are." The news spread quickly through the library. Jasmine's co-workers gathered around, sharing in her joy. Her supervisor brought out a box of cookies someone had left in the staff room, turning the break room into an impromptu celebration. When Jasmine called her mom at the hospital to share the news, she could hear her crying happy tears. "Baby, this is what happens when you lead with your heart," her mom said, her voice shaking with emotion. But Peter wasn't finished. He'd spent the morning talking with his tech team, developing an idea. "We're creating an app," he explained, pulling up a prototype on his tablet. "It'll connect elderly people who need help with young volunteers in their neighborhood. We're calling it Kindness Connect." "The scarf story showed us there's a hunger for connection in our communities," he continued. "People want to help, they just need a way to find each other." As they talked, other library patrons peeked curiously into the break room, drawn by the unusual gathering. Someone recognized Margaret from the news, and soon the story was spreading through the building. An elderly man reading the newspaper asked if he could sign up to be part of the new program. A college student immediately volunteered to help. "See," Margaret said, squeezing Jasmine's hand. "Kindness creates ripples we can't even imagine." Later that evening, as Jasmine walked home, she passed the bus stop where it had all started. The air was still cold, but she felt warm inside. Her phone buzzed with a text from Peter. The acceptance letter from Northwestern University's library science program had already arrived. She stopped for a moment, looking at the city around her. The same streets, the same buildings, the same busy people rushing past. But something felt different. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the knowledge that sometimes the biggest doors open with the smallest keys. Or maybe it was simply the understanding that in a world that often seemed dark and divided, a single act of kindness could light up more lives than she'd ever imagined. Spring had come to Chicago, but the purple scarf story hadn't faded with the winter snow. Instead, it had grown into something bigger than anyone could have imagined. The Kindness Connects program, born from that cold morning at the bus stop, was changing lives across the city. On a sunny Saturday morning, the community center in Southside Chicago was buzzing with activity. Jasmine stood at the front of the room, now wearing a volunteer coordinator badge, watching as elderly residents and young people mingled over coffee and donuts. The sight made her heart feel full. "Remember when we thought we'd be lucky to get 20 people to sign up?" Peter said, appearing beside her with his ever-present tablet. "Now we have waiting lists in every neighborhood." The program had started small, just a few elderly people who needed help with groceries or someone to talk to, matched with young volunteers through Peter's app. But it had quickly become something more. People weren't just helping each other. They were forming real connections that bridged age gaps, racial divisions, and neighborhood boundaries. Mrs. Chen, a 75-year-old Chinese immigrant, was teaching a young black teenager how to make dumplings in the center's kitchen. The teenager, in return, was showing Mrs. Chen how to video chat with her grandchildren in Beijing. Their laughter carried across the room, needing no translation. "You started all this," Margaret said, joining them. She still wore the purple scarf, even though the weather didn't require it anymore. It had become a symbol of sorts. One small act of kindness, and look what grew from it. Jasmine shook her head, smiling. "We all started it. Everyone who shared the video, everyone who decided to reach out to others, everyone who chose to care, we all did this together." The local news had picked up on the program's success. A reporter moved through the crowd, interviewing participants. An elderly man in a veteran's cap was explaining how his young volunteer had helped him navigate the VA benefits system. A teenage girl talked about how her elderly match had helped her with college application essays. "It's not just about young people helping older folks," the girl told the camera. "Sometimes we need their wisdom, their stories, their experience. We help each other." Peter's app had evolved too. What started as a simple matching system now included features for organizing community events, sharing skills, and connecting people with similar interests. Local businesses had gotten involved, offering spaces for meetings and discounts for program participants. "Look at this," Peter said, showing Jasmine his tablet. The app's map displayed hundreds of purple dots across Chicago, each representing a connection made through the program. "Every dot is a story like yours and my grandmother's." The community center's walls were covered with photos from various program events: garden plantings, technology workshops, cooking classes, storytelling sessions. But the most popular activity was still the simplest one, just sitting and talking, sharing life stories over cups of coffee. A group of high school students had started a History Keepers project, recording video interviews with elderly participants about their memories of Chicago. The city's changes, its challenges, its triumphs, all preserved in first-hand accounts that would have been lost without these connections. "You know what the best part is?" Margaret said, watching a young boy teach an elderly woman how to use a smartphone. "The stereotypes are disappearing. People are seeing each other as individuals, not just as young or old or any other label." The program had even caught the attention of other cities. Representatives from Detroit, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis had visited to learn how they could start similar initiatives. Peter's team was working on expanding the app to other locations, but he insisted on keeping it focused on genuine community connections rather than letting it become just another social media platform. "We're not trying to replace real human interaction," he explained to a group of visiting city officials. "We're just making it easier for people to find each other and connect in real life." As the morning went on, more people arrived at the community center. A local choir, made up of both young and elderly members, began setting up for a performance. They had met through the program and discovered their shared love of music. Jasmine watched as an elderly white woman helped a young Hispanic girl adjust her sheet music. Nearby, a young Asian man was deep in conversation with an elderly black gentleman about jazz history. These scenes would have been rare in Chicago just a few months ago. "Sometimes I wonder," Jasmine said softly to Margaret, "what would have happened if I'd just walked past you that morning at the bus stop?" Margaret squeezed her hand. "But you didn't. And that's the whole point, isn't it? Every moment gives us a choice, to walk past or to stop, to ignore or to help, to stay separated or to connect." The choir began to sing, their voices filling the room with harmony. Young and old, different races and backgrounds, all blending together in perfect unity. It was more than just music. It was a symbol of what their city could be when people chose to reach out to one another. And somewhere in the crowd, A purple scarf caught the morning light, reminding everyone that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures of kindness. The graduation ceremony at Northwestern University was a sea of purple and white. 5 years had passed since that cold morning at the bus stop, but for Jasmine Taylor, it felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. As she adjusted her graduation cap in the mirror of the preparation room, she couldn't help but smile at how much had changed. "Ready, sweetheart?" her mom asked, smoothing down Jasmine's graduation gown. She was wearing her nurse's uniform underneath. She had to rush to work right after the ceremony, but wild horses couldn't have kept her from this moment. "Almost," Jasmine replied, reaching for something special she brought for the occasion, the original purple scarf. Margaret had insisted on returning it for this day, saying it needed to come full circle. In the crowded auditorium, Margaret Wilson sat in the front row, using a program to fan herself in the warm June air. Next to her sat Peter, who had flown in from California despite having a major product launch the next day. They were surrounded by Jasmine's family, her proud mom, her little brother, not so little anymore, and her grandmother, who had knitted that fateful scarf. The dean's voice echoed through the hall. "And now, our student speaker, graduating summa cum laude from the School of Library Science, Jasmine Taylor." The applause was thunderous as Jasmine approached the podium, the purple scarf draped over her graduation gown. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "5 years ago, I gave this scarf to a stranger at a bus stop," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I didn't know then that I was actually giving it to my future mentor, friend, and second family. I didn't know that one small act would change not just my life, but the lives of so many others." She looked out at the crowd, seeing not just her own family and friends, but faces she'd come to know through the Kindness Connects program. There was Mrs. Chen, who now ran cooking workshops at 3 different community centers. The veteran who had become a regular speaker at local schools, sharing his stories with a new generation. Even the bus driver from that morning was there. He'd become an active volunteer in the program. "Today, I'm not just receiving a degree," Jasmine continued. "I'm carrying forward a legacy of kindness that has grown beyond anything we could have imagined. The Purple Scarf Scholarship has now helped 30 students achieve their dreams of higher education. The Kindness Connects program has spread to 15 cities across the country." She paused, touching the soft wool of the scarf. "But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The real story is in the connections we've made, the bridges we've built, the walls we've torn down. It's in the elderly gentleman who taught me chess during study breaks, and the young girl who showed him how to use video calls to connect with his grandchildren." In the audience, Peter smiled, thinking about how the program had evolved. The app now had over 1 million users nationwide, but more importantly, it had sparked countless real-world connections. Companies had started giving employees paid time off for volunteer work. Schools had incorporated community service into their curricula. Other cities had launched their own versions of the program. "As I stand here today," Jasmine said, her voice growing passionate, "I'm not just a library science graduate. I'm part of something bigger. We're all part of something bigger. Every time we choose kindness over indifference, connection over separation, hope over fear, we're building the world we want to live in, one small gesture at a time." She looked directly at Margaret, who was dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "My grandmother always told me that kindness is like bread. You should share it while it's still warm. But what I've learned is that kindness is also like a seed. Planted in fertile ground, nurture it with care, and it grows into something beautiful that can feed many souls." After the ceremony, amid the hugs and photos and tears of joy, Margaret pulled Jasmine aside. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small box tied with a ribbon. Inside was a new purple scarf, identical to the original. "Your grandmother helped me make it," Margaret explained. "My arthritis made it difficult, but she guided my hands. Just like you guided my heart that morning at the bus stop." Jasmine hugged her tight, both of them crying now. Around them, families celebrated, cameras flashed, and future dreams took flight. But in that moment, they were back at that cold bus stop, 2 strangers connecting through a simple act of kindness. Later that evening, at a small celebration dinner, Peter announced the next phase of the Kindness Connects program, a nationwide initiative to create community centers specifically designed to foster intergenerational connections. The first one would be built right there in Chicago, at the same intersection where a young girl once gave her scarf to an elderly woman. As the sun set over the Chicago skyline, Jasmine stood by the window of the restaurant, wearing both purple scarves now. She watched the city lights come alive, thinking about all the stories happening out there, all the potential connections waiting to be made, all the kindness waiting to be shared. Pretty amazing view, isn't it? Her little brother said, joining her. Yeah, she replied, smiling. But you know what's even more amazing? Knowing that somewhere out there, right now, someone is choosing to be kind. And that choice is creating ripples we might never see, but that will change the world in ways we can't even imagine. The purple scarves caught the last rays of the setting sun, glowing with promise. They were more than just wool and thread now. They were a reminder that the simplest acts of kindness could weave together the fabric of a better world, one human connection at a time.